In this month's Halifax Motorsports supportive video, we're going to discuss safety wiring your track motorcycle. If you're doing anything other than just the track days or a street stock race out at Atlantic Motorsports Park, you're going to have to fully race prep your bike, which involves lock wiring a few components. So every time you change a set of tires, change your oil, add some water to the motorcycle, you're going to have to re-lock wire. It's something that comes with a little bit of time, but it shouldn't take very long before you're good at it. So without further ado, let's get started with a few tips and tricks on how to properly safety wire your motorcycle. You need to grab yourself a roll of lock wire. It comes in various diameters. This particular spool is 32 thousandths of an inch, which is going to be ideal for most motorcycle requirements. It's not too thick that it's difficult to work with and not too thin that it's fragile. You'll also need a pair of lock wire pliers. These are just a cheap set from Princess Auto. Unfortunately, they're not reversible, but that's no big deal. The last little bit we can just twist by hand. Ideally, the smaller the pair of lock wire pliers, the better. It makes it easier for getting into tight spaces. We'll also need a pair of side cutters if your lock wire pliers aren't sharp, and needle nose pliers to bend over the final pigtail on the lock wire if you're not comfortable using the larger jaws of the lock wire pliers. Step 1 is to cut a length of lock wire slightly longer than you think you'll need. That way you'll be left with a little bit of excess. Second, you'll have to figure out which way to install the lock wire so both bolt heads are being pulled to the tightening direction. Obviously, if they're not being pulled tighter, they're getting pulled looser, which completely defeats the purpose of safety wire. Third, you want to figure out which way is easiest to install the lock wire so the last twist that you do to finish the pigtail is going to be in an easily accessible spot for you to get your lock wire pliers and to cut and bend over later so you don't cut your clothing or your hand or snag anything on the lock wire at the end. So we're going to install this first at the top and then pull it to the bottom bolt. Once you've passed the lock wire through the bolt hole, you can grab it with your needle nose pliers or lock wire pliers and pull it through till both ends match and are at about the same length. You want to take the back side and then fold it around the bolt so it's pulling it in the tightening direction, and also make sure it's underneath the piece of wire that's coming through the bolt hole. We're going to twist this one clockwise. You need to pull the lock wire down to where it meets up with your next bolt and then clamp the lock wire pliers on at that point. Now you can go ahead and pull the end of the lock wire pliers to twist them in a clockwise direction. The last few twists you can do by hand to help tighten it a little bit tighter, just making the lock wire more snug around the head of the bolt. Now make sure the twists line up with the next bolt. If it's a little bit short, no problem, just twist it by hand. If it ends up being too long, you'll have to cut it off and start over again. Now you can feed the lock wire, once you've got the twist lined up with the head of the bolt, through the bottom. Also again making sure that it's pulling that bolt head in the tightening direction. Once you pull the lock wire through the lower bolt hole, grab it with your lock wire pliers or needle nose pliers and finish pulling it the rest of the way through, giving it a sharp tug at the very end to make sure that the lock wire between the two bolt heads is tight up against the lower one. Now take the second piece of lock wire and make sure it's folded under the first piece. Grab both pieces together about an inch or two away from the bolt head and twist them in a counterclockwise direction. That's opposite from how we first twisted the wire, and this is going to ensure it stays tight. Then you can cut off the excess lock wire using either your side cutters or your lock wire pliers. Side cutters if your lock wire pliers aren't sharp. And then finally take your needle nose pliers or your lock wire pliers if you're comfortable with the larger jaws and fold the pigtail over in towards the bolt so there's no sharp parts of the lock wire extruding. And that makes sure when you're working on the motorcycle that you can't snag your work gloves, your riding gloves, or your hand on the lock wire at all. So here we have the final result, the end result, which is showing both bolt heads being pulled in the tightening direction by one another. You want to make sure that the lock wire between the two bolt heads is fairly tight. If it's not tight, then it'll allow the bolt heads to back off a little bit, which is obviously defeating the purpose. And finally, again, just making sure that that pigtail is folded in so you can't cut yourself on the wire.